We have two readings. Both of them are found in John's Gospel. We'll be talking today about the Apostle John. He is the one who has written this that you have memorized and written across your heart. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. I mean, this is just profound. It is just absolutely profound. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Jesus also said later on in John's Gospel, to the Jews, if you hold to my teaching, you will be my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. May God truly bless both of these readings. If you knew that you did not have long to live, and at the same time your mother was aging, whom would you ask to care for her when you're gone? That's some kind of question, isn't it? What qualities would you be looking for in that other person who would be watching over and caring for your very mother? The last decision Jesus Christ made on the cross was that decision. There were several women who stood at the foot of the cross, but there was only one disciple. All of the other disciples, we think, presumably, were back at the upper room with the doors shut and locked. Who was that disciple? John, the author of the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John epistles, and even the book of Revelation. Looking down from the cross, Jesus said, when Jesus saw, therefore, his mother and John the disciple, whom he loved, standing by, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, that disciple took her to his own home. That's the 19th chapter of John. John, who with Peter and James comprised the three most intimately close disciples to Jesus. John was given the responsibility of taking care of Mary, the mother of Jesus. If that's all we know about John, just that alone, we know all we need to know. John was the one that Jesus asked to care and watch over his mother. But there was a time when Jesus would not have chosen John to care for his mother. He is today called the disciple of love, but love was not always in John's heart. Virtually all reliable sources in early church history attest to the fact that John became the pastor of the church in Ephesus, the church that Paul the Apostle actually founded. All church history says that John became the pastor of that church. From there, during a great persecution of the church under the Roman Emperor Domitian, John was banished to a prison community at Patmos, a small island in the Aegean Sea off the coast of what is now modern-day Turkey. He lived in a cave there as a prisoner. And while he was there, John received and recorded his apocalyptic visions that were written down as we now have them, the book of Revelation. As a boy, John and his brother James, and James is another disciple, learned to fish with nets with their father. James, as you remember, was the first disciple to die, not long after Jesus' resurrection even. John was the last disciple to die. When Jesus called James and John to become disciples, John was the youngest one of the 12. John and his brother were initially followers of John the Baptist, but then Jesus came along and changed the rest of their lives. Now, John was not a perfect picture of a young man when he first met up with Jesus. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what's called the Synoptic Gospels, because they have so much in similarity, revealed John as being unattractively ambitious, with something even bordering on a violent temper, and with an intolerant heart. And of course, James and John, his brothers, were cut from the same cloth, so Jesus described them somewhat jokingly, but also pointedly, as the sons of thunder. In one instance, the disciples learned that a village in Samaria had refused hospitality to Jesus because he was headed on to Jerusalem. There was great tension between the Jews and the Samaritans. The Samaritans had intermarried, and the Jews looked down upon that. When James and John heard that a town in Samaria had refused to be hospitable to Jesus, they volunteered to Jesus that they would be glad to call down fire from heaven and to destroy the people of that village. And at the time that was said, Jesus had already given such power to these disciples. They had already healed people themselves. When we see John ready to burn up his enemies, we aren't likely to predict that he will someday be known as the apostle of love. Only the thunder at this point was apparent. In another instance, the brothers James and John took Jesus aside and asked him for a special favor. No doubt many of you will recall this. They wanted to be seated on Jesus' right hand and on his left hand, marking special privilege. Again, there was little evidence of a loving concern on John's part. He didn't have the interest of the other disciples on his mind, only his own ambition. Perhaps John saw the other disciples as competitors. And here's another story where John is hardly a noble character. John was reporting to Jesus an incident in which several of the other disciples were present too, but only John was bringing the news to Jesus. He said, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us." Well, that's one way to handle it, John. If you see good being done, don't think about the poor soul who's being healed. Just ask to see his credentials. Check his affiliations. Be sure he belongs to your religious union. Jesus answered John with both strength and kindness. Jesus said, "Do not stop him, for no one who does a deed of power in my name will be able to speak evil of me. For whoever is not against us is for us." There are other examples of John's brashness, and yes, even plain old rudeness, where he reveals that he is a long way from sainthood. So how did this son of thunder ever become the disciple of love that he's called today? How did that happen? Well, one factor surely is that John came to Jesus at such an early age. He had time to grow, to be shaped by his Lord. The more malleable the clay, the more the potter can do with it. When Jesus first met John, the Lord wasn't just looking at a son of thunder. The Lord was looking at who this son of thunder could become, his Christ-like potential, his willingness to grow, his flexibility when it comes to learning what truth is all about. John eventually wrote 4 books recorded in the New Testament. If you were to read all 4 of them, you would discover that John possessed a spiritual hunger for the truth. He uses the Greek word for truth 25 times in his gospel, 20 times more than the other epistles and gospels combined. He wrote, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. And only in John's gospel is Jesus to have said, if you hold to my teachings, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. There was something that I think became a turning point in John's life. It was the point of no return for him, the pivotal point. And it was the day when he and his brother James and the other apostle Peter all went with Jesus on top of a mountain. And there, on the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus' appearance began to change, and he became brilliantly white and began to glow. And there it was when 2 Old Testament prophets who had died centuries before, Moses and Elijah, showed up. I think that was the turning point for John. For there it was when God's voice spoke, and it was meant for these 3 disciples, and God said, this is my son, with whom I am well pleased. Now that was spoken at Jesus' baptism, but then God at the Mount of Transfiguration said one more thing. This is my son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. And I think that's the moment John, the son of thunder, became John, the beloved disciple. From that experience, I believe that John began to hunger not only for truth, but for something even more than truth. Jesus' kingdom needs people who have courage, ambition, drive, passion, boldness, and a zeal for the truth. John certainly had all of those, and he had them in spades, and that's why we see him getting in trouble sometimes, is because he had them to an excess. As we've already said, those kinds of qualities, if used to an excess, can become negative and not positive. But after Jesus' transfiguration, something else took hold of him and grabbed a hold of him, and it never let him go from that moment forward. John began to balance his hunger for truth with a newborn thirst to love. To love. Truth without love will eventually lack decency. It can even sink to a form of brutality. And yet, on the other hand, love without truth has no character. It can even sink to a form of hypocrisy. Truth without love might make a person right. It might make them correct. But they can end up living a stubborn, lonely, foolish life. And love without truth might make a person tolerant sentimentally, but that alone won't help raise anybody else's standard of living. We need a balance of both truth and love. We need to cultivate both of those virtues in equal proportions, I will even say. To follow Jesus means that we are to become sanctified, which means, of course, that we are to begin to look more and more like Jesus because we believe and we act more and more like Jesus. If we pursue anything in the spiritual realm, pursue a balance of truth with love. Know the truth, but uphold it with love. And so, let us close today at the same place where we began, at the foot of the cross, where Jesus was dying in agony, where several women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, kept vigil, where one and only one disciple remained. Throughout John's gospel, he never once mentions his own name. The Apostle John refuses to speak of himself in reference to himself. Instead, he speaks of himself in reference of Jesus. He never paints himself in the foreground as a hero, but uses every reference to himself to honor Christ. Rather than write his name in the gospel among the disciples, which might focus attention upon himself, John refers to himself simply as the disciple whom Jesus loved. That's found in John 13:23, 20 and 2, 21, 7 and 20. I could go on. He gives God the glory for having loved such a man as the Son of Thunder. John utterly is in awe at the marvel that Jesus would love him. And that began to change him on top of that mountain when Jesus was transfigured. And there in that moment, no greater balance was John ever to find than at the foot of the cross, where love and truth came together. The truth that Jesus would die for even one like this Son of Thunder, and the love that was expressed to John when the Son on the cross says to him, "Behold your mother, take care of her." It is that same balance of truth and love that you and I must seek every day. Every day. Amen.